The auctioneer's gavel struck the block of raw pine with a sound like a gunshot, echoing flat and final under the brutal Nevada sun. It was the summer of 1878, and in the dusty settlement of Prosperity Flats, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the canvas awnings and the sweat-stained hats of the assembled men. This was the third Tuesday of the month, the day the freight wagon from Sacramento brought supplies, mail, and on occasion, merchandise of a more delicate nature. Today, that merchandise consisted of 11 women, their passages paid by a matrimonial agency, now standing on a hastily constructed platform, squinting against the glare. Caleb Thorne stood apart from the other men, near the watering trough where the horses shifted and stamped, their tails flicking at flies. He was a man built on a scale that made the vast landscape seem momentarily smaller. His shoulders were as broad as a wagon axle, and his height forced most men to crane their necks to meet his gaze. A long-barreled revolver hung low on his hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth from years of familiarity. He was a gunslinger, they whispered. A man who had bought a homestead claim on the far side of Whisper Creek, a place no one else wanted because it bordered Bartholomew Croft's enormous cattle ranch. For 6 months he had kept to himself, a silent, intimidating fixture at the edge of their community. Now, he was here, at a bride auction, and no one knew what to make of it. The auctioneer, a portly man named Abernathy with a voice oiled by cheap whiskey, was working his way through the offerings. Next, we have Miss Matilda Perkins from Ohio. A fine, sturdy woman raised on a farm and knows her chores. Look at those hands, gentlemen, those are hands made for work. Who will start the bidding to cover her $20 passage fee? A rancher with a sunburnt face raised a finger. 20. I have 20, do I hear 22? Abernathy boomed. Caleb watched, his face impassive, his eyes a pale, assessing grey. He had seen 10 women presented. There was Matilda, strong and plain. There was a pretty young woman from Boston with delicate features who looked terrified. There was a widow with 2 young children who stood with fierce, protective pride. Each one was presented, bid on, and claimed by a local miner or farmer. And with each one, Abernathy would glance toward the silent giant, an invitation in his eyes. Each time, Caleb gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. By the time the 10th woman was led away by a sheepish-looking blacksmith, Abernathy's professional cheer was wearing thin. The crowd was murmuring. Thorne had the look of a man with purpose, but his purpose was a mystery. He had money, the weight of the coin pouch at his belt was obvious. Yet he had refused every single woman, from the most comely to the most practical. Abernathy mopped his brow with a greasy handkerchief and glared at Caleb. Well, Thorne? That's the lot. All the fine, respectable ladies have found homes. Unless you came here just to cast a shadow, I suggest you state your business. The murmuring stopped. All eyes turned to the giant. Caleb shifted his weight, the movement economical and sure. His voice, when it came, was lower than the crowd expected, a deep rumble that carried easily in the sudden quiet. You've shown me the ones everyone wants, he said, his gaze steady on the auctioneer. The strong ones, the pretty ones, the ones who know their place. He paused, letting the words settle in the oppressive heat. Now, show me the one no one wanted. Abernathy stared, his mouth slightly agape. The request was nonsensical. This was a business. Unwanted goods were a loss. What in blazes are you talking about? There's no such thing. They're all spoken for. There's one more, Caleb said, his voice flat, without inflection. The one you kept in the wagon, out of sight. Abernathy's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He had hoped no one had noticed. It was bad for business. He opened his mouth to deny it, but something in Caleb's unblinking stare cut the lie from his throat. The man wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. With a sigh of profound irritation, Abernathy waved a hand toward the freight wagon. Fine. On your own head be it, he muttered to his assistant, a lanky youth who scurried to obey. A moment later, the boy returned, leading a figure so out of place she seemed like a mirage conjured from the heat. She was a Chinese woman, small and slender, swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. Her hair was a glossy black, pulled back in a severe knot. But it was her dress that silenced the crowd completely. She wore a garment of light pink silk, a cheongsam, that clung to her form. It was a dress made for ornate tea houses and sheltered gardens, not the grit and dust of a Nevada frontier town. The delicate fabric seemed to shimmer, a fragile splash of color against the unrelenting brown of the world. She walked with her head held high, though her eyes were fixed on the dusty ground before her. She did not look at the faces staring at her, a mixture of raw curiosity and open contempt. Abernathy made a gesture of disgust. "Here. This is what's left. Can't cook American food, barely speaks the king's English, and Lord knows she's not built for the work this land demands." He didn't even bother to ask for a bid. He considered her a total loss. "Her name is Leanne." The crowd snickered. A few men made coarse remarks. She was a curiosity, a porcelain doll, useless. Caleb Thorne, however, moved forward. He stopped a few feet from the platform, his shadow falling over her. For the first time, she looked up, and her dark eyes met his. In them, he saw not fear, but a profound and weary resignation, a deep, banked stillness that he recognized. It was the look of someone who had endured much and expected to endure more. He turned back to Abernathy. He didn't haggle. He didn't speak. He simply reached into his pouch and tossed a heavy gold coin onto the auction block. It landed with a solid, definitive chink. It was a double eagle. $20. Enough to cover the passage. Then he tossed another beside it. Abernathy's eyes widened. $40. It was more than the highest price paid all day. For this? It made no sense. He snatched the coins before Caleb could change his mind. "Sold," he croaked, his corporate greed overpowering his confusion. Caleb stepped up to the platform. He didn't grab the woman's arm or push her forward. He simply extended his hand, palm up. It was a massive hand, calloused and scarred, but the gesture was one of quiet invitation. After a long moment of hesitation, Leanne placed her small, trembling hand in his. He closed his fingers gently around hers and led her down the steps, through the stunned and silent crowd, toward his waiting buckboard wagon. He helped her onto the seat, his touch surprisingly careful, before climbing up beside her. Without a backward glance, he slapped the reins, and the wagon rolled out of Prosperity Flats, leaving a cloud of dust and unanswered questions in its wake. The journey to his homestead was a study in silence. The sun beat down, and the creak of the wagon wheels was the only sound between them. Leanne sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped in the lap of her pink silk dress, which was already collecting a fine layer of ochre dust. She stared straight ahead, at the endless expanse of sagebrush and distant, heat-hazed mountains. Caleb drove the team with an easy, practiced hand, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He was acutely aware of the small, still woman beside him. He could feel her tension, a rigid line of control that must have been exhausting to maintain. He had a canteen of water, but he didn't know how to offer it. The simple gesture felt impossibly complicated. What did he say? What did she understand? He had acted on an impulse he barely understood himself, a raw, protective instinct that had risen up when he saw the look in her eyes. Now, the reality of his decision sat beside him, fragile and foreign. After nearly 2 hours, he turned the wagon off the main track and onto a barely visible trail that wound into a shallow valley. A line of cottonwoods in the distance marked the presence of Whisper Creek. His homestead was nestled against a low bluff, offering some protection from the wind. It was not a cabin, not yet. It was a dugout, a home carved from the earth itself, with a front wall of stacked sod and a single wooden door. A small, neatly tended vegetable garden grew to one side, a surprising patch of orderly green in the wild landscape. A rough corral held 2 cows and a calf. He pulled the wagon to a halt and set the brake. "We're here," he said, his voice sounding rough in the quiet. Leanne looked at the dugout. It was a hovel, a burrow in the ground. But her expression did not change. She had clearly expected no better. Caleb got down and came around to her side, offering his hand again to help her down. She accepted, her touch light as a bird's feather. He led her inside. The interior was larger than it appeared, cool and dark after the glare of the sun. It was one large room, meticulously clean. A stone fireplace was built into the back wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made. In the other, a curtain of canvas had been strung up, creating a small, separate space. He pointed to the curtained area. "That is for you." Inside, she saw a simple cot with a clean blanket and a small crate for her belongings, though she had none. "The spring is behind the house. The privy is up the hill." He felt clumsy, his words like stones. He was used to solitude, to a life that required little explanation. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her eyes took in everything, the worn rifle leaning by the door, the small stack of books on a shelf, the way the floor was swept clean of dirt. That first day passed in a strained, watchful quiet. Caleb worked outside, mending a fence post. Leanne stayed inside, standing by the open door, watching him. She did not know what was expected of her. She was in the home of a giant, a man the whole town seemed to fear, in a land that was utterly alien to her. She waited for an order, a command, a sign of what her servitude would entail. But none came. When the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Caleb came inside. He built a fire and put a pot of beans and bacon on to cook. He motioned for her to sit at the table, and they ate in the same thick silence, the only sounds the clink of his fork against the tin plate and the crackle of the fire. The silence was finally broken not by words, but by the sky. As dusk settled, the air grew heavy and still. A strange, greenish light bled through the doorway. Caleb looked up from his plate, his head cocked. "Storm's coming," he said, more to himself than to her. He went outside. The clouds were rolling in from the west, a bruised, churning mass that swallowed the stars. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. He quickly checked on the livestock, ensuring the gate to the corral was secure. The 2 cows were calm, but the calf was skittish, pressing against its mother. He had just stepped back inside when the first drops of rain hit the sod roof, fat and heavy. Within minutes, the drizzle became a deluge. A flash of lightning lit the dugout, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very ground. Leanne flinched, her hands tightening in her lap. Caleb watched the rain through the open door. It wasn't just a storm, it was a cloudburst. The dry creek bed would not be dry for long. A sudden, cold dread washed over him. The small pasture where he let the cows graze during the day was in a low-lying area, right next to the creek. He had brought them into the corral, but a section of that lower fence was weak. If they spooked. Another deafening clap of thunder rattled the dugout, and he heard it, a frantic bawling from the corral, followed by the splintering sound of wood. The calf. It must have panicked and broken through the weak spot, heading for the low ground out of pure, terrified instinct. "Stay here," he ordered Leanne, grabbing a heavy oilskin coat and a coil of rope. He plunged out into the storm without waiting for an answer. The world outside was a chaos of wind and water. Rain lashed his face, and the ground was already turning to slick mud. He could barely see, but he followed the sound of the terrified calf. He found it near the creek, which was no longer a trickle but a churning, brown torrent, rising with terrifying speed. The calf was trapped, its leg wedged between 2 rocks, the rising water already swirling around its belly. Caleb waded into the current, the water shockingly cold and strong. He worked his rope around the calf's chest, but the animal was panicked, fighting him. He pulled, his boots sinking into the mud, his muscles straining. The current was pulling at both of them, threatening to sweep them away. He needed more leverage. He wrapped the other end of the rope around the trunk of a small cottonwood and pulled again. The rope was old, frayed from use. As he put his full weight into it, it groaned, stretched, and then snapped with a sickening crack. He stumbled backward, falling into the churning water. He surged to his feet, cursing. He was going to lose the calf. It was a blow he couldn't afford. He was about to make a desperate lunge for the animal when a shape materialized beside him in the driving rain. It was Leanne. Her pink dress was soaked through, plastered to her small frame, the silk now a deep, muddy rose. Her hair had come undone, and black strands were whipped across her face by the wind. "The rope," she shouted over the roar of the storm, pointing at the two useless ends. He shook his head, shouting back, "It's broken." "No good." She ignored him. She grabbed both broken ends of the rope and brought them together. Her fingers, which he had thought so delicate, moved with a blur of speed and precision he could not follow. She was not tying a simple knot. She was weaving, braiding, looping the frayed strands back into themselves, her hands working with an intelligence of their own. In less than a minute, where there had been two broken ends, there was now a single, thick, reinforced splice. It looked strange, but strong. She looked up at him, her dark eyes intense. "Now," she commanded. Stunned, Caleb did as she said. He took the repaired rope and pulled. The knot held. It held firm against his entire weight and the pull of the terrified animal and the force of the flood. Together, they heaved. The calf's leg came free from the rocks, and Caleb half-dragged, half-carried it to higher ground, where its mother was waiting, bawling anxiously. He collapsed against the tree, breathing heavily, soaked to the bone and shivering. He looked at Leanne, who stood watching him, her small frame trembling with cold. She had not hesitated. She had run into a flash flood, into a terrifying storm, to help him. And she had done something with that rope he had never seen before, a trick that had saved his animal. The fragile porcelain doll from the auction was gone. In her place stood a woman of unexpected, quiet strength. He pushed himself to his feet. "Let's get inside," he said, his voice rough with a new, unsettling respect. As they staggered back toward the faint light of the dugout, a flash of lightning illuminated the area in front of the door. Caleb stopped dead. There, in the fresh mud, were deep tracks from a wagon and two horses. They were not his. Someone had been here while they were down at the creek. A cold feeling, colder than the rain, settled in his gut. Nailed to his door was a piece of paper, already limp from the rain. Inside, the fire was burning low. They dripped water onto the dirt floor, shivering in the sudden warmth. While Leanne hurried to add wood to the fire, Caleb tore the note from the door. The ink was running, but the words, gouged into the paper with a thick pencil, were clear enough. "This land isn't for you. Or your kind." He crushed the paper in his fist. Bartholomew Croft. It had to be. Croft hadn't liked it when Caleb filed a claim on this piece of land, the only one in the valley with a year-round spring that Croft didn't already own. He'd made veiled threats in town. Now, it seemed, the threats were no longer veiled. And the words "your kind" had a new, uglier meaning. It wasn't just about the land anymore. Croft had seen Leanne. He looked over at her. She was wringing the water from her long, black hair, her back to him. The muddy silk dress clung to her, outlining the delicate bones of her shoulders. She looked impossibly small and vulnerable, yet he had just seen her face down a storm with a courage that shamed most men he knew. He threw the sodden note into the fire, where it sizzled and blackened. "We should get dry," he said. He handed her a spare blanket from his bed. "Your room." She took it with a nod and disappeared behind the canvas curtain. Caleb stripped off his wet coat and shirt, standing before the fire, letting the heat bake the cold from his bones. The events of the past hour churned in his mind. The storm, the calf, the note. And Leanne. Always, Leanne. When she emerged from behind the curtain, she was wrapped in the dry blanket. She had left the ruined silk dress behind the canvas. She came and sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water he had poured for her. For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. "The knot," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Where did you learn to tie a knot like that?" She looked up, her eyes meeting his across the table. "On the ships," she said, her English soft but clear. "From China." The sailors, they use many ropes. I watched them. It was the most she had said to him. He nodded slowly. It held. You saved my calf. Thank you. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. She had not expected thanks. It was necessary, she replied simply. Another silence fell, but this one felt different. The tension of the storm had washed away some of the awkwardness between them. They were two people in a dugout, with a fire and a locked door, while the world raged outside. Why did you choose me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. At the market. You refused all the others. Caleb stared into the fire. He had known this question was coming. He owed her an honest answer. Because of my wife, he said, the words tasting of rust in his mouth. He hadn't spoken of her in years. Leanne's eyes widened slightly. You have a wife. Had, he corrected gently. She died. 3 years ago. He took a deep breath. Her name was Nita. She was Shoshone. Her people lived in these mountains long before men like Abernathy or Croft ever saw them. He looked at Leanne, his gaze direct and heavy. The people in town, they never saw her. They saw an Indian. Something less than them. Something to be ignored, or mocked. When she got sick with a lung fever, the doctor wouldn't come out this far. Not for her. He fell silent, the memory of physical pain in his chest. She died right here, in this room. And I buried her up on that bluff. The day I buried her, I swore I would never again stand by and watch someone be judged by the color of their skin or the place they were born. He looked at Leanne, his heart aching with a truth he was only now putting into words for himself. When Abernathy brought you out, I saw them look at you. And I saw the same look on your face that I used to see on Nita's. The look of a person who has made themselves strong on the inside because the world outside is so cruel. I didn't choose you because I wanted a wife. I chose you because I couldn't stand to see them sell you like cattle. The money I paid wasn't a bride price. It was the price of your freedom. This is your home, for as long as you want it. You are not my servant. You are my partner, if you'll have me. Tears welled in Leanne's eyes, shimmering in the firelight. She did not let them fall. She understood now. This quiet, dangerous man was not her master. He was her protector. She took a shaky breath and gave him her own truth in return. I was not a bride. In my city, I worked in a laundry. The owner, he was not a kind man. When he died, he owed much money. The men he owed took everything. They took me. They said I was part of his property. They sold me to the agency in San Francisco. She looked down at her hands. I did not know it would be a market like that. I hoped it would be a new life. A chance. Caleb's hands curled into fists. He had been right. She was a slave in all but name. Croft's note, "Your kind," was not just an insult, it was a claim of ownership, a belief that people like her were objects to be bought and discarded. The rain began to subside, replaced by the steady drip of water from the eaves. A fragile understanding was growing between them in the warm, firelit room. They were two outcasts, bound by a shared experience of loss and prejudice. The next morning brought a clear, washed sky. But the peace was short-lived. Just after noon, 3 riders appeared, cresting the hill. Caleb recognized the man in the lead instantly. It was Bartholomew Croft, flanked by 2 of his hired guns. Caleb met them in the yard, his stance relaxed but wary. Leanne stood in the doorway of the dugout, a silent shadow. Croft was a big man, florid and fleshy, who sat his expensive saddle like a throne. He surveyed Caleb's small homestead with a sneer. "Thorn. I see you got my message." "I got it," Caleb said, his voice even. Croft's gaze slid past Caleb to Leanne. His eyes lingered on her, filled with a coarse appraisal that made Caleb's blood run cold. "I see you bought yourself some company. An exotic little thing. But you've got no business on this land, and you've certainly got no business bringing that filth into my valley." "This is my land," Caleb stated, holding up the deed from his pocket. "Filed and registered with the territorial office. The spring is on my property line." Croft laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Paper. Paper is meaningless out here. Power is what matters. And I have the power." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you $500 for your claim. And I'll throw in another 100 for the girl. Save you the trouble of feeding her." The insult was so profound, so dehumanizing, that for a moment, Caleb could not speak. The rage that rose in him was a white-hot fire. He felt the familiar, deadly calm settle over him, the feeling that had guided him through a dozen gunfights in a life he was trying to leave behind. He took a slow step forward. "Croft," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You will get back on your horse. You will ride off my land. And if you or your men ever come back, I will not be so polite." Croft's face hardened. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," Caleb said. "This is my home. And that is my partner. We are not for sale." For a tense moment, the two men locked eyes. Croft's hired hands shifted, their hands hovering near their pistols. But something in Caleb's dead-still certainty gave Croft pause. He was a bully, not a fool. He knew Thorne's reputation. With a final, venomous glare, Croft wheeled his horse around. "You'll regret this, Thorne. You'll find this valley has its own laws." The three men galloped away, leaving the threat hanging in the clean morning air. Caleb turned and looked at Leanne. She had not moved from the doorway. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but a fierce, burning resolve. The battle for their home had just begun. 6 months later, the valley was locked in the grip of winter. Snow lay thick on the ground, and the wind howled down from the mountains. But inside the small home by Whisper Creek, there was warmth and light. The dugout had been expanded, its front now a proper wall of sturdy timber with a real glass window. A small but solid barn stood where the old corral had been. The partnership between Caleb and Leanne had transformed the homestead. Leanne's garden, planted with strange vegetables from seeds she had carefully carried from her homeland, had yielded a miraculous harvest. Using techniques of drying and pickling Caleb had never seen, she had preserved enough food to see them through the harshest winter. She had also revealed a talent for embroidery, her needle flashing as she created intricate designs on scraps of linen. A friendly freighter who passed through once a month was now her agent, trading her work for coffee, sugar, and other goods in the next town over, where people appreciated fine things, no matter who made them. Bartholomew Croft had made good on his threat. A week after his visit, the water in Whisper Creek had slowed to a trickle and then stopped. He had built a crude dam upstream, on his own property, intending to starve them of the water their claim was legally entitled to. For a day, despair had settled over Caleb. But then, remembering the old stories his wife Nita had told him, he had taken a shovel and walked the length of the bluff behind their home. Just as she had said, he found it, a small, secondary spring, hidden in a thicket of willows, a source Croft knew nothing about. It was enough. That had been Croft's final mistake. Caleb was not a man without connections. He rode to the nearest town with a telegraph office and sent a message to a territorial marshal he had served with years ago. He laid out the facts, the illegal damming, the public threats, the intimidation. His report was backed by a signed statement from the freighter who had witnessed Croft's bullying. 2 weeks later, the marshal arrived. An official investigation into Croft's land and water practices began. Faced with federal charges and the crumbling of his local power, Croft sold his ranch for a fraction of its worth and disappeared from the territory. Now, on a cold winter's night, the valley was quiet. Caleb sat at the table, reading a newspaper the freighter had brought. Leanne sat across from him, embroidering a piece of cloth. The soft glow of the oil lamp illuminated her focused expression. She was stitching a design of 2 willow branches, their leaves intertwined. Caleb put down his paper and watched her. She had filled out, the harsh lines of hunger and fear softening from her face. She moved with a quiet confidence, a sense of belonging that had been absent before. She had made this burrow in the earth a home. He looked at the canvas curtain, which still cordoned off her sleeping area. Behind it, carefully folded on the crate, was the light pink silk dress. She had painstakingly cleaned and mended it, and sometimes, on quiet evenings like this, she would wear it. It no longer seemed like a costume from another world. It was simply a part of her, a link to a past she had survived. He reached across the table, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers, stilling the needle. She looked up, a question in her dark eyes. "I think," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "we built a good life here, Leanne." A genuine smile, full of warmth and light, transformed her face. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. "We did, Caleb," she said. "We did. The world would always try to tell you who was worthy, who deserved a place at the fire. But they had learned that sometimes, the strongest homes are built not with perfect materials, but with the discarded stones, the people the world had tried to throw away. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.